She thought she could lock him behind his own fence to teach him a lesson about following the rules. Until he bought the lock, the gate, and the land it stood on, turning her weapon into his victory. What happened next divided the entire neighborhood and proved that sometimes the best revenge is simply owning what they tried to use against you. You don't expect to wake up one morning and find your life turned upside down by a wall of steel. But that's exactly what happened to Ezekiel Washington, a 54-year-old black rancher in the suburbs outside Shreveport, Louisiana. Picture this. The sun just breaking over the horizon, the cattle restless, his pickup loaded, ready to haul feed. Ezekiel drives down the familiar dirt path that connects his ranch to the county road. He slows near the bend as always, but instead of open ground, he's met with something shocking. A brand new fence stretching across his only access road. No warning, no phone call, just a blockade standing tall, chain link glinting in the morning light. Ezekiel slams the brakes. Dust swirls. He gets out, staring at the fence like it's some kind of cruel joke. But there's nothing funny about it. What the hell is this? He mutters under his breath. The fence doesn't just cut off his truck, it cuts off his livelihood. Feed deliveries, livestock trailers, veterinary trucks, none of them can pass. It's like someone decided overnight that his ranch didn't belong there anymore. That someone was Delilah Sinclair, president of the local homeowners association. She's in her early 60s, sharp suits, and a reputation for controlling everything from mailbox colors to the length of people's lawns. Neighbors whispered that she ran the HOA like it was her private kingdom. But this was different. This was personal. A neighbor, Beaumont Caldwell, came walking by, coffee mug in hand, shaking his head. Ezekiel, you didn't hear? Delilah had contractors in here yesterday. Said the board approved it. Claims your ranch traffic is lowering property values. Ezekiel turned slowly toward him. She thinks fencing me and is going to raise them? Beaumont sighed, shifting uneasily. You know how she is. She said it's about the image of the neighborhood. Ezekiel felt heat rising in his chest. Image. That was the word she used when she first approached him months ago, questioning why a man would keep cattle in what she wanted to call a high-value residential community. He'd ignored her then, choosing not to pick a fight. But this was an ambush. He climbed back into his truck, hands gripping the wheel tighter than he realized. Behind him, the cattle bawled, waiting for feed that wouldn't come until he found another way out. He knew one thing for certain. Delilah had declared war, whether he wanted it or not. Later that afternoon, Ezekiel showed up at the HOA office. A converted house with blinds always half-drawn. It smelled of stale air freshener and paperwork. Delilah was there, seated like a queen at her desk, pearl necklace catching the light. You put a fence across my land, Ezekiel said, voice calm but heavy. She didn't flinch. Across the access road, and technically that road falls within the association's jurisdiction. We had complaints. Trucks, trailers, noise. It doesn't fit the neighborhood's character. Ezekiel leaned on the desk. Lady, my family's been working this ranch long before you thought about moving here. You don't get to erase that with a fence. Delilah folded her hands, smug smile settling in. We'll have to agree to disagree. The board supports this decision. If you want to challenge it, you're free to take it up legally. Ezekiel studied her face, memorizing the arrogance in her expression. She wanted a fight, but not with fists. She wanted a battle of papers, meetings, courtrooms, a slow grind where she thought time and money would break him down. Instead of shouting, he straightened up and walked out without another word. Delilah thought she'd won that round. But Ezekiel knew something she didn't. Ranchers don't survive by rushing at every storm. They survive by waiting it out, studying the wind, and choosing the right moment to act. That night, he sat on his porch, staring at the blocked road. His daughter, Serafina Washington, joined him, handing over a glass of sweet tea. Daddy, what are you going to do? She asked softly. Ezekiel sipped slowly. Sometimes you don't push back right away, baby. Sometimes you let folks think they've cornered you. Then you remind them the game isn't over. Serafina looked at him, worry in her eyes, but also trust. She'd grown up watching her father handle setbacks with patience that drove others crazy. The cattle bawled again in the distance, reminding him of tomorrow's struggles. For now, he knew only one thing. Delilah Sinclair had drawn the line. But fences aren't always as permanent as they look. But if Delilah thought this battle was finished, she was about to learn it had only just begun. The morning after the fence went up, Ezekiel Washington was at the hardware store in Minden, Louisiana, loading supplies into his pickup when a familiar voice called out, "Ezekiel, you hear about the meeting tonight?" It was Magnolia Rivera, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down from the HOA president. Magnolia wasn't one to gossip, but when she spoke, people listened. She leaned against her SUV, her expression tight. "Meeting?" Ezekiel asked, straightening up. Magnolia nodded. "Delilah's called a special session. She's telling everyone you're running an industrial site out of your property. Says the board needs to protect the community's character. She's making it sound like you're operating a slaughterhouse." Ezekiel clenched his jaw. "A slaughterhouse? Magnolia, you've been over. You know what I do. I've got cattle, a few goats, nothing crazy." "I know that," Magnolia said firmly. "But she's spinning it different. If you don't show up tonight, she'll set the tone. You'll get steamrolled." Ezekiel let out a slow breath. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed standing in front of people pleading his case, but Delilah Sinclair was forcing his hand. That evening, the HOA meeting room was packed tighter than a Sunday service. Folding chairs lined the walls. Residents squeezed in shoulder to shoulder. Ezekiel stood at the back, cowboy hat in hand, while Delilah presided from the front like a judge about to deliver a sentence. "As many of you know," Delilah began, voice smooth and commanding, "our community has always maintained a high standard. Clean streets, orderly homes, a shared respect for appearance. Unfortunately, recent activity on one property threatens that standard. Heavy trucks, livestock noise, trailers parked along the road. This isn't what we agreed to when we chose to live here." Whispers spread across the room. Ezekiel felt his stomach tighten, but he stayed quiet. He wanted to hear just how far she'd go. Magnolia raised her hand. "With all due respect, Delilah, Ezekiel's land was here before the HOA. He's not running a factory. He's just taking care of his animals. It hasn't stopped me from enjoying my home." Delilah's smile didn't falter. "Magnolia, I understand your perspective, but it isn't just about one person. It's about the larger picture, property values, the atmosphere of our neighborhood." That was Ezekiel's cue. He stepped forward, hat still in hand, boots striking the tile floor. "My family's been ranching this land for decades," he said, voice steady. "We're not outsiders. We're not some business moving in from nowhere. We belong here. The road you blocked, that's my access. That's how I feed my cattle. That's how I make my living." The room grew quiet. Delilah tilted her head. "No one is saying you don't belong, Ezekiel. We're simply saying your operation may not align with the character of this neighborhood. If you want to keep it up, there are rules." "Rules?" Ezekiel's voice sharpened. "Show me where it says a man can't raise cattle on his own land. Show me the page where it says I have to ask permission to use the road that's been open longer than this neighborhood's existed." Murmurs spread again, louder this time. Some residents nodded. Others looked uneasy. A man in the second row, Augustus Pemberton, raised his hand. "Look, I bought here because it's quiet. I didn't sign up to live next to livestock. I support the board. This isn't the place for a ranch." Magnolia shot back immediately. "And what's he supposed to do, Augustus? Just walk away from his family's work because you don't like the sound of cows? That doesn't sound fair." Ezekiel turned to face the crowd, locking eyes with anyone willing to meet his. "This isn't just about cattle. It's about whether one person gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Today it's me. Tomorrow it's you. If you let this stand, then none of us really owns what we think we own." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Then, like a storm breaking, voices clashed, some siding with Ezekiel, others backing Delilah. Delilah raised her gavel, an actual wooden gavel she'd bought for herself, and slammed it against the table. "Enough. The board has acted within its authority. The fence will remain in place until further notice." Meeting adjourned. People filed out, muttering. Magnolia brushed Ezekiel's arm as she passed. "You said your piece. More people heard you than you realize." But as Ezekiel walked back to his truck under the dim parking lot lights, his chest still burned. Delilah wasn't backing down. She was doubling down. And if he didn't find another way to fight back, the fence would stay for good. But Delilah had underestimated one thing. Ezekiel's patience was never weakness. It was his strategy. The fence wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a chokehold. Each day it reminded Ezekiel Washington that someone else had seized control of what should have been his freedom. The first week was the hardest. Feed trucks had to park half a mile away on the shoulder of Highway 171, and Ezekiel and his son Josiah hauled 50-pound sacks by hand across uneven ground. The cattle bawled louder than usual, spooked by the sudden change. "Daddy, this is killing us," Josiah said one morning, sweat dripping down his forehead as he hoisted another bag. "We can't keep this up." Ezekiel adjusted his gloves, jaw set. "We can, we will, but this fence, it won't last forever." Serafina, his daughter, pitched in, too, bringing water to her father and brother as they worked. The family turned it into a routine, but resentment grew with every step they took around that blockade. Meanwhile, Delilah Sinclair carried herself as if she had already won the war. She drove past Ezekiel's property in her silver Lexus, glancing at the ranch as if inspecting a nuisance. One afternoon, she stopped near the edge of his fence line. "Mr. Washington," she called out, lowering her window. "You could make this easier on yourself. Sell the cattle. Convert your land into something more appropriate for the neighborhood. Gardens maybe, or lease it out. People would pay good money." Ezekiel wiped his brow, leaning on the handle of his shovel. "This land doesn't need a makeover, Mrs. Sinclair. It needs respect, and I'm not selling what my father and grandfather built." Her smile tightened. "Suit yourself, but you're making things harder than they have to be." She drove off, tires crunching gravel, leaving Ezekiel standing in the heat, his blood simmering. By the end of that month, the blockade began affecting more than chores. A vet scheduled to examine his herd nearly turned back when she realized she couldn't access the road. She only agreed to park along the highway after Ezekiel begged. Even then, she warned him, "If this keeps up, I may have to stop making calls out here. Liability's too high." That night, Ezekiel sat at the kitchen table, shoulders slumped, staring at unpaid bills. Josiah slammed his fist down. "Why don't we just cut the fence down? Bolt cutters. Couple of hours, problem solved." Ezekiel shook his head. "That's what she wants. She's waiting for me to do something reckless. Then she'll slap me with fines or drag me to court. No, we fight smart." Serafina touched his arm. "Then how, Daddy? What's the plan?" Ezekiel looked at both of his kids. "You keep your head down. You work harder than you think you can. And you let people show you who they are. Folks are watching more than we know." It wasn't easy advice to live by. Ezekiel's neighbors began taking sides. Some, like Magnolia Rivera, offered small kindnesses, bringing groceries, lending her driveway for feed deliveries. Others avoided him completely, embarrassed or unwilling to challenge Delilah. And a few, like Augustus Pemberton, went out of their way to complain. "Your cattle stink up the whole street," Augustus shouted one afternoon while Ezekiel repaired a gate on his property. "This isn't farmland. It's a neighborhood. You don't belong here." Ezekiel didn't rise to it. He simply looked up, steady and unblinking, until Augustus turned red and stormed off. But inside, Ezekiel's patience wore thin. The breaking point came when Josiah's truck broke down. Without direct access to the ranch road, the tow company refused to come onto the property, citing HOA restrictions. Ezekiel had to spend extra money just to get the vehicle hauled out. Another reminder of the trap Delilah had set. That evening, Magnolia stopped by with a casserole dish. "Ezekiel," she said gently, "I don't know how much longer you can hold out." She's not budging. Ezekiel accepted the dish with a tired smile. That's the thing about people like Delilah. They push until they think you've got no options left. But there's always an option. You just have to wait for the right one. Magnolia tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Ezekiel didn't answer. He glanced out toward the fence where the last light of day glinted off the chain link. He didn't know exactly when the opportunity would come, but he believed it would. But what Ezekiel couldn't see yet was that the very opportunity he prayed for was already moving quietly in his direction. It was late September when Ezekiel Washington first heard the news. He was at Brookshire's in Ruston, Louisiana, picking up fencing wire and dog food when Magnolia Rivera walked up behind him in the checkout line. She leaned close, lowering her voice as though she carried a secret too sharp to say out loud. "Ezekiel, you won't believe this," she whispered. "The property with the gate, the one that connects to the county road. It's going up for sale." For a moment, Ezekiel thought he'd misheard her. He set down the feed bag he was holding. The tract right in front of mine? Magnolia nodded quickly. Yes, the people that live there, the Thorntons, they're moving back to Arkansas. Delilah hasn't announced it yet, but the sign goes up this week. Ezekiel felt something stir deep inside him. For weeks, he'd been biting his tongue, swallowing his anger every time he passed that fence. Now here it was, a chance so perfect it almost felt like providence. He went home and told Josiah and Serafina. They were sitting at the kitchen table, paperwork scattered between them. Kids, he said, lowering himself into a chair. That land with the gate is going on the market. Josiah leaned forward, eyes wide. You serious? If we had that, we'd control the only entrance. Serafina frowned. Daddy, can we even afford it? You've been fighting just to keep up. Ezekiel rubbed his chin. It won't be easy, but sometimes the Lord gives you one shot, and you better take it. They sat in silence for a moment, each of them weighing the cost. Finally, Josiah spoke again. If you think it's worth it, I'll back you. Whatever it takes. Serafina reached across the table, placing her hand on her father's. Me too. I know you'll do the right thing. The next morning, Ezekiel called the realtor listed on the sign. Her name was Vivian Blackwood, a brisk woman who spoke like she was always 3 steps ahead of you. Yes, Mr. Washington, she said over the phone. The Thornton property will officially list this Friday, but I can tell you there's already interest. A few potential buyers are circling. Ezekiel's grip on the phone tightened. Can I see it today? Vivian paused, then said, If you're serious, I can make time. That afternoon, Ezekiel toured the land. Standing at the gate, he placed his hand on the cool metal, imagining what it would feel like to turn the lock, knowing it was his. The property itself wasn't much, just a modest house, some scrubby pasture, and a line of oak trees. But its value wasn't in the soil. Its value was in control. Whoever owned this property owned the gateway. Vivian walked beside him, clipboard in hand. It's priced fairly, but I'll be honest. Someone like Mrs. Sinclair might be very interested, if only to keep things orderly. She's on my list to call. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. You don't need to call her. Call me. I'll make the offer. Vivian studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. All right then, let's see what you can do. The following days were a blur of bank meetings, paperwork, and late-night phone calls. Ezekiel poured everything he had into the deal, even cashing in part of his retirement savings. Josiah picked up extra shifts at the feed store to cover household bills. Serafina took on tutoring jobs to ease the strain. Delilah, meanwhile, remained unaware. She carried on, smug as ever, telling neighbors the fence had solved their problem. She even bragged at a dinner party about how she'd restored order to the neighborhood. Then came closing day. Ezekiel walked into the title office with his boots polished and his hat in hand. As he signed the last paper, the weight he'd been carrying for weeks began to lift. The keys slid across the table toward him, cold metal, small in size, but heavier than anything he'd ever held. He drove straight to the property, parked by the gate, and stepped out. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the lock that had once symbolized his captivity. He slid the key in, turned it, and felt the bolt give way. The gate creaked open, and for the first time in months, Ezekiel felt something close to freedom. Serafina and Josiah arrived minutes later, both climbing out of their cars with wide eyes. Daddy, you did it. Serafina whispered, tears forming. Josiah laughed, slapping his father's back. Delilah's going to lose her mind when she finds out. Ezekiel only smiled, quiet but certain. She built a fence to trap me. Now I hold the only key that matters. But Ezekiel knew the real battle wasn't over yet, because once Delilah learned the truth, the neighborhood would never be the same. The news hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. Within a week, word spread that Ezekiel Washington had purchased the property with the gate. At first, it circulated in whispers, neighbors trading stories at mailboxes, exchanging glances as Ezekiel drove by with a quiet confidence they hadn't seen in months. But when Delilah Sinclair found out, it wasn't through a whisper. It was through the sight of Ezekiel himself unlocking the gate one crisp Saturday morning with his pickup idling behind him. Delilah was out for her morning walk, dressed in her usual tailored tracksuit, pearl earrings flashing in the sun. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring across the road as Ezekiel swung the gate wide. the metal squealing like a trumpet announcing victory. "Mr. Washington," she barked, marching forward. "What do you think you're doing?" Ezekiel didn't rush. He slid the lock back into place, pocketed the key, and leaned against his truck. "Morning, Mrs. Sinclair. I'm just using my gate." Her face flushed. "Your gate? That property is under HOA authority. You can't just waltz in here like you own the place." Ezekiel met her gaze, steady and calm. "Except I do own the place. Signed the papers last week. Got the deed and the keys right here." He tapped his chest pocket. Delilah's mouth opened and closed, no words forming for a moment. Finally, she sputtered. "That land was supposed to you. This is outrageous." Ezekiel smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "What's outrageous is thinking you could fence me in forever. Tables turn, Mrs. Sinclair. Best get used to it." Neighbors gathered, drawn by the commotion. Magnolia Rivera stood off to the side, arms crossed, a grin tugging at her lips. Augustus Pemberton showed up too, muttering something about ruining the community. The small crowd watched, hungry for drama, as Delilah struggled to regain her composure. "This isn't over," she hissed, finally, spinning on her heel. "The board will hear about this." Ezekiel climbed back into his truck, easing it through the gate, his engine humming as he disappeared down the road. For the first time in weeks, his cattle would be fed on time without backbreaking detours. That evening, the Washington family gathered on the porch. Serafina leaned against the railing, still marveling. "Daddy, you really did it. You turned her own game against her." Josiah laughed. She probably choked on her morning coffee when she heard. Ezekiel's smile was small, but genuine. This wasn't about embarrassing her. It was about showing that you don't let people write you out of your own life. You wait, you plan, and when the chance comes, you take it. Meanwhile, Delilah was in damage control. She called an emergency HOA meeting, sending emails dripping with alarm. "Neighbors," the message read, "recent developments have jeopardized the integrity of our community. We must act decisively to preserve what we built." But when the meeting came, fewer people backed her than before. Residents had seen the look on Ezekiel's face when he unlocked that gate. They had seen the dignity in his patience compared with the arrogance in her overreach. Magnolia spoke up during the meeting. "Delilah, with all due respect, you picked this fight. You blocked a man's only road. He found a lawful solution. Maybe instead of digging deeper, we should admit the board went too far." The room stirred. Some still muttered support for Delilah, but the tide was shifting. Ezekiel didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to. He sat on his porch instead, rocking slowly, the cool evening air carrying the sound of his cattle moving contentedly in the pasture. For the first time in months, he felt peace. But peace for him meant something very different for Delilah. She paced her kitchen late into the night, anger boiling as she scribbled notes for legal motions she planned to file. Her husband, Montgomery Sinclair, finally said what no one else dared. "Delilah," he sighed, setting down his glass of water. "Maybe it's time you let this go." The man bought the land fair and square. She spun on him, eyes blazing. "Let it go? Do you know what this means? He holds the key. He controls the image of this neighborhood now." Montgomery shook his head, weary. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Her silence was louder than any argument. Back at the ranch, Ezekiel knew Delilah wouldn't stop easily, but he also knew he had turned the tide. Control was no longer hers to wield freely. It rested in his pocket, small and metallic, ready to remind her every day that fences work both ways. But while Ezekiel had won this round, the fallout in the community was only beginning, and it would test not just Delilah's pride, but the entire neighborhood's sense of fairness. By the end of the week, the neighborhood was split clean down the middle. On one side were those who admired Ezekiel's patience and his quiet victory. On the other were Delilah's loyalists, the ones who saw his purchase as a threat to the order they thought she had established. At Sunday service in Monroe, Magnolia Rivera overheard the whispers in the church foyer. "Did you hear about Washington?" a woman murmured. "He bought that property. Owns the whole gate now." Another voice replied, "Good for him." Delilah went too far. But just as quickly came a sharper tone. "It's reckless. Now he controls the neighborhood's only main access." Who does that? Back at home, Ezekiel couldn't ignore the ripple effect. Cars slowed when they passed his ranch. Some neighbors waved with quiet support. Others kept their eyes straight ahead, unwilling to acknowledge him. One afternoon, Augustus Pemberton marched up to Ezekiel's gate. He wore a pressed polo shirt, jaw set like he was going into battle. "Washington, you think you've pulled one over on all of us, but you're holding this community hostage." Ezekiel was unloading hay from his truck when he heard Augustus calling. Ezekiel turned slowly, brushing dust off his gloves. "Hostage? I didn't build that fence, Augustus. I just bought the land your president used to cut me off. That's not hostage. That's called surviving." Augustus's face reddened. "Don't play the victim. You could have fought fair in court like anyone else." Ezekiel stepped closer, voice steady, but sharp. "Fair? Was it fair to wake up one morning and find my road blocked without warning? Was it fair to choke my ranch while people like you stood back and watched? You tell me what fair looks like." Augustus faltered, opening his mouth, then closing it again. Before he could fire back, Magnolia approached from across the street. "Augustus, you've got a short memory," she said. "If someone had cut off your driveway, you'd have called the police in 5 minutes." Ezekiel didn't break the rules. He played by them better than Delilah did. Augustus muttered something under his breath and stormed off, his frustration trailing behind him like dust in the wind. Later that evening, Serafina joined her father on the porch. "Daddy, why do people act like you did something wrong? You bought that land fair and square." Ezekiel took a long sip of coffee. "Because when people get used to one person holding power, they don't like it when that power shifts. Makes them nervous. Makes them wonder if the rules were ever real in the first place." Serafina tilted her head. "You're saying it's not about cattle or fences. It's about control." He nodded. "Exactly." The HOA board met again that week, Delilah presiding with fire in her eyes. She slammed papers on the table. "We cannot allow this situation to stand. Mr. Washington has created a dangerous precedent. If he controls that gate, he controls all of us." But even among her usual allies, cracks showed. A board member, Cordelia Ashford, raised her hand. "Delilah, with respect, Ezekiel didn't do anything illegal. He bought property. That's the system. If we keep pushing, we're the ones who will look unreasonable." Delilah bristled. "So we just let him run wild? We just hand over the character of this neighborhood?" Cordelia sighed. "Maybe the character isn't what we thought it was." The room fell quiet. Outside the official meetings, the debates grew personal. At backyard barbecues, in grocery store aisles, in text message threads, neighbors weighed in. Some admired Ezekiel's resilience, calling him a man who refused to be broken. Others saw him as a symbol of defiance, someone who had exposed the HOA's weakness. And yet, for all the tension, there were moments of surprising empathy. One evening, Magnolia stopped by Ezekiel's ranch with her husband. She brought peach cobbler, still warm from the oven. "You know," she said with a smile, "you gave people hope. Maybe they won't say it out loud, but plenty of us are glad you stood up to her. You reminded us we don't have to let one person control everything." Ezekiel thanked her, the sweetness of the cobbler cutting through weeks of bitterness. For the first time, he felt the neighborhood might find its balance again. Still, he knew Delilah wasn't done. Her pride wouldn't let her walk away quietly. And until she faced the truth, the community would stay divided, caught between fear of change and the relief of seeing justice tilt, if only slightly, toward fairness. But as much as Delilah fought, even she couldn't escape the growing realization that Ezekiel had changed the rules forever, and the lesson was sinking in deeper than she cared to admit. By October, the tension that had gripped the neighborhood began to cool, though not entirely. The fence still stood where contractors had built it, tall and rigid. But the meaning of that fence had changed. What once symbolized control and exclusion now served as a reminder of how quickly power could shift when patience met opportunity. One Saturday morning, Ezekiel sat on his porch sipping coffee, the autumn sun warming his shoulders. Serafina joined him, notebook in hand, preparing to tutor a neighbor's son later that day. "Daddy," she said, glancing toward the gate in the distance, "do you think this is finally over?" Ezekiel didn't answer right away. He rocked gently in his chair, eyes fixed on the land he'd fought so hard to keep accessible. "Over? Not exactly, but it's settled enough. Folks know now that they can't just push someone aside because it makes them uncomfortable." Serafina scribbled something in her notebook, then looked back up. I've learned more watching you handle this than any book could teach me. He smiled faintly. And what's that? That patience doesn't mean weakness, and that sometimes the best revenge is living on your own terms. Before Ezekiel could respond, Josiah's truck rolled into the drive. He hopped out, waving a document. Daddy, look at this. They posted the new HOA minutes online. Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as Josiah handed him the paper. The minutes showed a new resolution. The board would no longer make unilateral decisions on fencing or access roads without full community input. It was a small concession, but it was a victory nonetheless. Looks like they finally learned something, Josiah said with a grin. Ezekiel nodded slowly. They learned that control isn't permanent. You abuse it, and it slips away. That afternoon, Magnolia Rivera stopped by with her husband. They sat together under the shade of the porch, plates of leftover cobbler between them. Magnolia leaned forward, speaking with quiet conviction. You know, Ezekiel, you didn't just win for yourself. You showed everyone here that we don't have to bow down to Delilah or anyone else. You taught us that dignity counts for more than intimidation. Ezekiel chuckled softly. I didn't set out to teach anything, Magnolia. I just wanted to feed my cattle. Sometimes, Magnolia replied. That's how lessons work. People watch what you do under pressure, and they remember it. Meanwhile, in the Sinclair house, Delilah was confronting a silence she wasn't used to. For weeks, she had tried to rally her supporters, but fewer people showed up at meetings. Even Montgomery, her husband, had stopped arguing. You need to let it go, he told her one night at the dinner table. The neighborhood's moving on. Maybe you should, too. Delilah stared down at her plate, her appetite gone. She hated to admit it, but he was right. The power she had clung to so fiercely wasn't hers anymore. She had pushed too far, and Ezekiel had answered in a way she never saw coming. Back at the ranch, Ezekiel walked the fence line with Josiah, the late afternoon light painting the pasture gold. The cattle grazed quietly, unaware of the battles that had been fought over their feeding road. You know, son, Ezekiel said, life's funny. People think strength means shouting louder or hitting harder, but most of the time strength means knowing when not to strike, letting your silence speak until the right moment comes. Josiah nodded, thoughtful. And when it comes, you act. Exactly, Ezekiel replied. You act, and you don't hesitate. Serafina joined them, her laughter carrying across the field as she waved at a neighbor passing by. Slowly, the neighborhood was returning to something resembling normal. But it was a new kind of normal, one where people understood the limits of control and the weight of fairness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ezekiel leaned against the gate he now owned, running his hand along the cool metal. A fence meant to trap him had turned into the symbol of his resilience. He thought about his father and grandfather, men who had taught him to weather storms with patience, men who had told him that land was more than dirt. It was identity. He realized now that his battle with Delilah wasn't just about cattle or property lines. It was about dignity, about standing firm without losing himself in anger. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like a simple property dispute. But for Ezekiel and his family, it was something far greater, proof that injustice doesn't always need a loud answer. Sometimes it needs a quiet one, steady and deliberate, until the tide turns in your favor. And as he locked the gate one final time that evening, Ezekiel whispered to himself, fences don't keep a man down. They just show him where to climb. The lesson was clear. Don't let anyone dictate your worth, your rights, or your place in the world. Hold steady. Choose your battles wisely. And when the chance comes, take it without hesitation. If you believe in stories of resilience and dignity like Ezekiel's, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes the smallest keys unlock the biggest lessons.